Hey there, people who watch my videos. As is customary on Saturdays, today I am going to talk to you about an episode of Superman the Animated Series titled Feeding Time. And as is also customary, I'll give you the old spoiler warning before I quickly sum up the episode, and then and only then will I get into my thoughts on the episode. A janitor at Star Labs named Rudy Jones and his partner in crime, Martin LeBeau, are trying to steal some chemicals from Star Labs, but they're caught. In their escape, Rudy is bathed in the chemicals and is transformed into a purple energy vampire. He attacks a cop and finds that he absorbs memories from his victims as well as sustenance. He then comes after LeBeau, where Superman intervenes, and Rudy finds out that when he leeches off of Superman, he also gets Superman's abilities for a short while. He kidnaps Superman to keep him as a permanent source of sustenance and superpowers. Jimmy Olsen finds out where Rudy, now dubbed by the media the Parasite, is hiding out and helps Superman escape. Superman uses a special suit Emil Hamilton built for him to avoid kryptonite poisoning to avoid Rudy's attacks. Rudy defeats himself when he accidentally absorbs the kryptonite Hamilton had in a safe. We're told that Rudy probably has no more of his memories, so Clark's secret identity is safe. But we end the episode with Rudy leeching off of a cockroach with a wicked smile on his face. Bum bum bum! This episode really feels more like a 20-minute horror movie than a traditional superhero cartoon. We start with the poor schmo who gets turned into a hideous monster by circumstances beyond his control, like a werewolf movie or Swamp Thing. Then the episode turns into a completely different kind of horror movie, with Rudy kidnapping Superman and planning to keep Superman in prison forever to be used as a source of energy and superpowers. Being held prisoner where nobody knows where you are and your tormentor holds more power over you than you have, that's especially terrifying and is the root of horror films like Split or The People Under the Stairs. It's really impressive to me just how scary the folks behind this series were able to make this episode. I'm not saying it's going to give anybody nightmares, but it's kind of intense in some places for a Saturday morning cartoon. For instance, the scene where Rudy attacks the cop. When she sees he has something in his hand, I already knew it was the rat, but the way the scene is presented, it's still a very tense situation. And even when we see that it is the rat, that doesn't diffuse the situation and actually only makes things scarier. Not fully being able to see Parasite in this scene reminds me of the scene where we first see the Joker in the full Joker form in the 1989 Batman movie, or in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when Buffy's friends find out Angel has now turned evil. Something about keeping the menacing character out of the light does wonders for making the audience uneasy. In this regard, I do wish that we hadn't gotten a good look at Parasite just before this when we saw him grab the rat. In fact, I'm not even sure if we needed to see him grab the rat. Remove the scene of him feeding on the rat, and what do you miss from this episode? If we go from seeing him burning alive in the back of LeBeau's truck to seeing him cross the road and the cop pulling her gun on him, we would still be pretty sure this is Rudy, and it would allow this episode to maintain even more of that horror vibe. And if you're thinking the scene with the rat shows us Rudy's powers in action, I call foul right there. We got to see his powers in action when he attacks the cop, and later Superman, so I don't think we needed that one short scene, especially when it minimizes the effect of the scene where we see him fully for the first time since his mutation. And speaking of mutation, I have to say, while Rudy certainly doesn't look normal, he looks much less terrifying after his accident than he does when he is in mid-transformation in the back of the truck. I'm sure it would have been much more difficult to animate, but I wish we could have had something closer to Alex Ross's designs of Parasite from Kingdom Come, where he looks like he actually is a victim of horrible burns with scars covering his entire body. I get it, the overall design sense of the DC animated universe meant, more than anything else, simplicity, to make it easier to animate and also to make it more pleasing for the eye. But this design for Parasite makes him look like he has a fairly normal purple skin, which, yes, that's weird, and people will react strongly when they see him walking down the street, but it's not screaming because of the worst thing that you ever saw in your life kind of scary. Of course, I should keep in mind that it's possible the people making this episode didn't want to make Parasite or the episode any scarier than it already was. Maybe they were happy with the level of fear it already induced, or maybe they did want to go stronger, but their bosses told them no. There are some legendary rules these creators had to follow when working on Batman the Animated Series in service of keeping things a little bit more child-friendly than the people making the show wanted, so it's very possible some similar sets of rules were imposed on this show, keeping them from making Parasite as monstrous as he could have been, and would later be in, say, the animated adaptation of All-Star Superman. Getting past the look of Parasite and the tone of this episode, there are some more minor things I wanted to address here. Much like Toyman in Fun and Games, this is a character who is very interesting, but I can't see him being used much more past this episode. We do see him a few more times in this series and later in Justice League, but his shtick of absorbing memories pretty much makes him a one-trick pony. There's not much more that can be done with that, so while I really love seeing Parasite here, and I would have really liked seeing an exploration of his abilities, I don't know how much more you could do with him. Not to mention, once you've opened the can of worms of him possibly still remembering Clark's secret identity, how do you follow up on that? It's not too problematic to see a few of Superman's enemies only used once or twice, but it starts to add up over time, and the creators of this series made a point that Superman does not have as expansive of a rogues gallery as Batman does, so it would have been good if we could have had some of these lesser villains retooled in such a way where they could make multiple appearances in this series over time. We see Emil Hamilton now has a huge chunk of kryptonite, and coming right off of A Little Piece of Home, I can't help but wish that episode ended with Superman taking the kryptonite to Star Labs instead of throwing it into outer space. Especially with A Little Piece of Home making us think that kryptonite was so rare, it's just a little frustrating seeing that immediately Star Labs has somehow come up with a pretty big chunk of it. And other than testing this suit Hamilton made for Superman, what is Star planning to do with this kryptonite? Is Superman even a little bit curious? In the commentary for the final episode of the series, Bruce Timm said initially they wanted to have the general public be scared of Superman and have him slowly earn their trust and respect. This premise was shot down by the president of DC Comics, Jenette Kahn. That would have been kind of an awesome premise for a TV show. Kahn! Anyway, having Star Labs keep a piece of kryptonite for any reason at all would work well with that premise, but since Superman has yet to do anything even kind of untrustworthy at this point, it's a little weird. Yeah, I know, it's there so that Parasite can be defeated in the end, but a quick, "we're using this to study cheap renewable energy sources, Superman" line would have been good enough for me. I was also surprised to see Lois barely in this episode. Outside of the scene where Jimmy decides to go look for Parasite's lair, I don't think Lois is in the episode at all. I don't mind because it allows Jimmy to step up and be a little bit more than the typical comic relief. I do wish we could have seen Jimmy do this kind of thing more often in this series, though. I know there are episodes where he's there in the thick of things, but to see him actually take initiative and look for Parasite when everyone else in the Daily Planet told him he should stick to photography, that makes me wish we could have seen him go further as an actual character in this series. It would have been nice if we could have had an occasional ongoing arc for Jimmy where Perry recognizes that with some guidance, Jimmy could make a great reporter someday. We got to see a little bit of that in the comics in the early to mid 2000s. Part of that was no doubt Perry feeling guilty about his own failed relationship with his deceased son and hoping he could do better with a surrogate relationship with Jimmy. I wouldn't want to see this series tackle Perry's son dying or anything that heavy, but it would have been great to see Perry give the speech about how when he started at the Planet, he was delivering papers when he was 12 and he has to work hard to become a reporter, stuff like that. One incredibly minor nitpick I had about this episode was how Rudy got the name Parasite. At the beginning of the episode, LeBeau calls Rudy a little parasite, which is a very typical way of inserting a soon-to-be supervillain's name into dialogue so that they will later take that name for themselves. It's silly and contrived, but if that's how they have to name him, fine. But then later in the episode, Angela Chen on the news also calls him a parasite because of his powers. Honestly, this would have been fine if they had just stuck with this one. It's almost like they forgot halfway into the episode that they had already provided a way for him to get his supervillain name, which is a shame because it feels more natural when Angela comes up with a name than when LeBeau does. Overall, I like this episode. We get some good Jimmy stuff, even if it doesn't go as far as I would like later in the series. We get to see Superman use his brains over his brawn when defeating the villain, and we get to see a fascinating interpretation of a character I've never seen used to such good effect in the comics. So those were my thoughts. I hope you guys liked this episode and this review. And if you did, I do reviews of animated superhero shows every Saturday, so be sure to see what I'll have to say about another episode of Superman the Animated Series next weekend. And be sure to see what else I'll have to say throughout the week. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.